So everyone here, my name is Jason Peterson with Woodstock Hemp Company, and if you've been to some of these sessions already, quick rundown is we've kind of broken down the hemp farming process into 4 different steps: pre-planting, planting, and growth and maintenance. Today we're going to cover flowering and compliance testing, and some of the aspects that are involved in that process. And then the next session will be harvest and harvest practices and kind of post-processing. So a little bit about myself, kind of the quick and dirty, because you've probably already heard this before. Background is in indoor marijuana cultivation on the medical side before switching over to outdoor cultivation on hemp, and no longer operating indoor cannabis operation just because I've been growing the hemp business, and it's been doing really well, and I've enjoyed working outside and working with the plant and learning how to do it, and doing it successfully with large-scale agronomics in play. So we've got Dan here as well from Rose City Labs. So they were located in Portland and have been around for a very long time. I'll go ahead and have Dan talk about himself and their lab for just a minute and make his introduction.
Hello, my name is Dan, and I've been around cannabis basically my entire life, but I am an aircraft, been around aircraft, so and I'm a serial entrepreneur. So I kind of just started a dispensary a while back, and I started a laboratory, and I kind of just keep growing. And I've been around the industry a long time. I kind of was there in the beginning when there was just a couple of us labs helping write the laws and all that. So that was pretty exciting, and just here we are.
So are you to blame for the 0.3 THC compliance then?
No.
Dan would have no limit on the THC level if he had his way. So we're just going to dive right in and go into the flowering period. I mean, so it's kind of the point in time where we're like, all right, great, crop's still alive, pests haven't devoured it, it's driving. We're probably seeing some significant size being packed onto our plants at this point in time. It should be right around August 1st. So we're right on the 45th parallel. That's when our light cycle is going to hit that 12-12. What that means is 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of night. That's what's going to trigger a hormonal change in the plant to stimulate flower development. And with these plants, we obviously are always planting or always want to plant all female plants. So hopefully we're seeing some nice big female flowers start to develop. Right around that same time, we're going to notice, again, huge amounts of growth. It's typically called the stretch. So that's when the plant, in a dying effort, not a dying effort, but recognizing that it needs to expend as much energy as possible to get as big as possible and enhance every chance it has to reproduce, it's going to pack on a ton of size. So that's another indicator of when you can actually tell your plants are started to flower, even if you haven't noticed any flower development yet, is you'll see those auxiliary branches and those tops start to just get taller and taller and taller and really stretch out. So that's an indication, all right, cool, my plant is flowering, we're ready to go. At this point in time, you really should switch, or should have already have switched. If you know that you're going to be flowering on August 1st, you should have already have switched from a vegetative fertilizer blend to a flowering blend. So we've got nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. We want to reduce the amount of nitrogen at this point, and we want to really up our P and K levels. That will enhance the plant's flowering capability. It's typically called a bloom booster. And what it's going to do is allow them to put on bigger buds faster. And that's what we want to do at this point. Like, our ultimate goal now is to try and get these plants as big as possible, as healthy as possible, with as much flower mass on them as possible. If we have too much nitrogen in the soil, or we're still feeding them a vegetative blend, that's going to extend that veg period out. In our climate, it's not wise to do that, because typically our harvest period is going to be at the beginning of October to the middle of October. And if we start stretching that harvest out towards the end of October, we run the risk of weather events, cold, mold, any number of issues that could scuttle a crop right there at the very end. So I've seen some farms, like if their plants are small and they had a late planting, they may try and add some nitrogen, keep them in a vegetative state a little bit longer to get them bigger, which it works. But again, understanding that there's kind of a deadline of November 1st of, like, you really need to have your plants out of the ground and your crop harvested by then. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to a ton of risk. So I've harvested as late as October 31st before, and not because I gave them too much nitrogen, but just because I wanted to see how long I could leave my plants out there. And you can do it successfully as long as the weather cooperates, but I definitely don't recommend it. Definitely if you're on this side of the Cascades, it's very wet and they will be very susceptible to mold. So going through, again, the focus here is making sure our plants are healthy. We should be walking the fields every single week, making sure we're staying on our weeding. We don't want to choke these plants out. Any weeds that we have in and around them are going to start competing for resources. So we're going to make sure that we don't have any of those in the fields, or removing as many of them as possible. So going through flowering plants, typically are going to have an 8 to 11 week flowering cycle. So if we've got, again, that August 1st or end of that last week of July, we can expect to have those plants start to finish right at the very end of September, beginning of October. In some cases, depending on what resources you have, you may want to stagger your harvest if you have the ability to do that. So on some of the farms that I've worked for, we'll plant an 8-week plant, and then we'll plant in the next field a 10-week plant, and giving ourselves 2 weeks to go through and harvest that first field before we actually move into the second field. If you've got 500 acres and all of our plants are harvesting or are basically flowering and finishing at the exact same time, we now have to find a way to harvest all 500 acres within a specific timeline. But if we can stagger our harvest out, we can spread our resources, we can reduce stress, and we can ensure that we're harvesting each plant at its peak of ripeness. So that's what we did. I was the project manager for a 500-acre farm out in Central Oregon, and so we had some fields that were finishing at the end of September, first week of October, second week of October, and then lastly on the 21st of October. So it helps alleviate a ton of stress and just helps you kind of plan your harvest strategy around when your plants are going to be finishing. And if you're working with any sort of seed supplier that's reputable, they'll be able to tell you exactly based off of the strain that you're buying when you can experience or when you should see that plant finish. Let's see. So one of the biggest things about the flowering period is culling males. So as I said, like we want only female plants. We don't want to have any pollinated buds. Anytime a bud is pollinated, the plant no longer is exerting energy to produce CBD and trichomes. It's now solely concerned with producing seeds for propagation. So anytime we pollinate a female plant, we're losing CBD volume. So we want to make sure that every plant in our field is female. So the first and best way to do that is to make sure you're only planting feminized seeds. Again, going back to having a reputable seed supplier. Most feminization rates are going to be 1 in 2,500 or 1 to 1 in 4,000. So meaning that if you planted 2,500 plants, you could expect one of those plants to be a male. That doesn't mean hermaphrodited plants. You can stress a female plant and it will hermaphrodite. I mean, that's just based on the grower's experience. So that isn't what we're talking about here, but actual true male plants. So what that equates to roughly is about 1 plant per acre. So if you have 100 acres, and you can probably expect to pull out 100 males out of your field. And so what we do on all the projects that I work on, it's a very labor-intensive process, but there's really no other way to do it, is you just have to walk those fields every single day. And what you're looking for are pollen sacs on the where the nodes are on the branches, and they just look like little sacks of bananas, and that's an indication that you've got, and that's a male plant. And so what we do, we tell all of our teams, they travel with backpack sprayers with water. And so if we see a male plant, what we'll do is we'll hose that plant down with water to get it nice and wet. That way, if we do end up rupturing any of the pollen sacs while we're removing it, that the pollen doesn't disperse. So what we'll do is we'll spray them down with water. Then we'll take a large 55-gallon hefty bag, put it over Gestapo style over the plant, tie it at the bottom, and then just whack it down at the base. And then we haul them out to the end of the rows. And then when we're done, we come back with a trailer or pickup and then go take them and put them in the dumpster. So that seems to be the most effective way that I've found to do this labor-intensive process. It ensures that, again, if you do happen to rupture any pollen sacs, you're not dispersing pollen amongst your fields. And have always had really good unseeded flower results using that method. So I highly recommend it. I'm sure everyone has their own way to go about doing it, but that's what we've found on a large scale that tends to work really, really well. You'll want to make sure you're doing 2 or 3 passes per field. You're not going to be able to catch them all the first time, because what's going to happen is, even if it's the same strain, you could have a week to 2 weeks difference in flowering. So I could have a plant that's the same plant flower July 31st, and then the one right next to it maybe actually doesn't start flowering until July 7th. And that's because of just the phenotypic variation within that strain. These plants haven't been bred for a long enough period of time to really have well-defined phenotypes. And a phenotype is any sort of characteristic that a plant has, whether it be smell, bud structure, lateral size, taste, flavor. So when we see strains, I mean, they're kind of within this average. And as we continue to breed seeds, we're going to slowly kind of get those phenotypes tighter and tighter and tighter until they're really well defined. But even right now, we're seeing great variation. Like I said, up to like maybe a week's difference in flowering time. So you could make one pass 1 week and walk every single plant and only see 10 males, and then the next week you could go by and see 10 more males, even though you just walked it. And it's because those 10 males flowered later, flowered after you walk past it that first time. So make sure you walk your field at least 2, possibly 3 times if you can. I mean, you should be walking it every week anyways, but for when you start noticing those buds developing, you should really be looking for those male plants and walking those fields, like I said, at least 2 or 3 times. And then really after that point, once you get those males out of the fields, really from there, we've got basically one other goal left, and that is to get our compliance testing done. So that's really the last hurdle that we have before harvest. So compliancy testing here in the state of Oregon is basically just to certify that our hemp is in fact industrial hemp. I was talking with some ODA people a couple weeks ago about compliancy testing. It used to be done like the first year you had to do it with the ODA. Anymore now you just have to work with the lab to do it. And it's up to, I mean, you have to, right? Like legally you have to, but I was talking to the ODA and they were telling me the other day that they think that upwards of 40% of hemp farmers don't have compliancy testing done, which is a shame, because I mean, it really just kind of tanks the market and kind of like we all lose our credibility when we don't do that. So, and I think there's a big push, or should be a big push from the labs to ask to see those compliancy documents. And if you're working with a reputable lab, they're going to ask to see them. If you're working with a contract, they're going to ask to see those compliancy documents, at least all the ones that I've ever seen. So, again, it's nothing that you just make sure you're doing it and abiding by the rules, so we can all just, make sure we have a good reputation to rest our hats on. So, the rules have kind of changed this year. It used to be that when they did compliancy testing, the threshold was 0.3 delta 9 THC. That's changed this year, so now it's going to be 0.3 total THC. You should still, if you're growing a hemp plant and it is a hemp, and you're growing it well, there shouldn't be any reason why you're going to be above that 0.3 as long as you're testing in that week 4 to week 5. So it's just very important to make sure you're timing your testing properly. So it's important to know when your plants start flowering so that you can start forecasting when you should have your testing done. So I've had testing done as late as September 22nd, 24th, and still been well below the 0.3 total THC. Typically I try and schedule my compliancy testing right around the 10th through the 15th to allow myself plenty of time. 28 days. We'll start harvest, usually October 8th, right around there. So because you've got 28 days in the state of Oregon. There are some on the federal level. There are some talks about possibly changing that. There are states that are going to like a 15-day window. Oregon, as of right now, is not. They're going to stay with the 28-day. And I think that if any of you guys do have, hear anybody talking about it, and we really should push back against the 15-day window, because it just doesn't give us as farmers enough time to perhaps change our harvest schedule and timeline if we happen to run into a situation where our plants maybe are testing hot. And so it's just that 28-day grace period gives us enough time to be able to forecast and plan and schedule a proper harvest. And realistically, like if you're growing a cannabis plant, like a true cannabis plant where it's THC and not CBD, even in that week 4, week 5 testing, your THC numbers should be well above 0.3. I mean, they should be 2-3%. So I mean, it'd be pretty obvious if you were growing like a cannabis strain versus a hemp strain. Yeah. And so that's pretty much what, I've got as far as like the flowering. So like I said, once you get past the compliancy part of things, at that point, then you're just kind of smooth sailing until you get to harvest, and then working on your, making sure you've got all your harvest timelines, all your harvest strategies in place so that you guys can do that successfully. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan. He can go through how they do their testing. And yeah.
All right, it's gonna be hard to top that. Now, this is gonna be the hard part. Usually, we're the most hated in the industry. Well, no, I helped him. No, And they, of course, don't always listen, and then they come back later and change the rules because they realize that they should have listened. All right, so when it comes to testing and sampling, you want to know your numbers, and you can actually start doing testing ahead of time. But if you want to do that, it's research and development testing to try to track your numbers. And in order to do that, you're going to try to follow the same guidelines that we follow at the laboratories that's set by the state. And so you're going to want to take 8 to 10 inches of the tops of the plants and do that randomly throughout your field, not just pick 1 or 2 plants. Let's see. So that will actually help you chart your progress and help you be able to determine when you might be able to harvest your plants and pinpoint. He says that some plants might start a little lighter, this or that, but this will help generalize your entire fields. So what happens at the laboratory when it comes back? Well, when a certified or for certification pre-harvest hemp sampling, we dry it at 50 degrees Celsius, and this is all written into the requirements that we have to follow by the state for 24 hours, and this helps minimize the decarboxylation. Then we turn around and homogenize the samples. We homogenize as much as we can with the sample that we have. Some of the bigger stems at that point don't go through as much. We have to sieve everything through a certain screen. And if it doesn't go through that screen, and with some of these stalks, as you guys know, hemp is a very strong product, and some of these stalks and stems and stuff will not go any smaller. We can't really break them down much more. So that's where we're at with that. And this is only the pre-harvest hemp. Now, post-harvest hemp is different. So samples extracted for hemps, minimum 4 to 5 grams to ensure homogeneity. So we do analyze everything via HPLC. We can verify everything with the LCMS. LCMS will help be able to measure the mass of the compounds and differentiate it out a little bit better. Then we turn around and issue a report to the client, and if it's compliant, or for the compliance, we also report to the ODA. Well, you guys actually have to, yeah, that's a very good point. You have to submit a sample request for pre-harvest hemp sampling prior to you harvesting your field. And you can find those forms online for the ODA. If you use us, I got authorized this year to turn it into an electronic form. So visit our webpage, you can fill it out electronically. It's submitted then and there. And once it's submitted online, we will contact you and set up a time to come out. So it's actually a pretty simple process. A little bit of paperwork. You got to draw a diagram of your fields. You got to have an understanding which fields you're going to harvest. And actually, the ODA allows now greenhouses and indoor hemp fields. So that's kind of cool. So I'll have to ask for questions later. So the post-harvest hemp sampling, we do the biomass, and basically, if your stuff is testing high, you're able to mix it in a little bit more with the stems and stalks and stuff, and then we turn around and take larger quantities and is able to homogenize all that into the process. And it's a little different of an extraction process, but it all works pretty good. So again, we take the top 8 to 10 inches of wait, this is post-harvest hemp. Results, plants, biomass, simple protocols, yep, 8 to 10. So R&D tests cannot be used for compliance testing. Now, we do highly recommend you do it so you can be able to figure out and adjust your THC accordingly if it's too hot. And then once you do meet that requirement, you can turn around and ask for compliance testing. Goes in, that's what we can do.
So you can do an R&D test and have it go right into compliance?
Do what?
You can do an R&D test and have it go into compliance?
No. So, we do an R&D test first to figure out where you are, and that test is we run it across the machinery and everything the same way. We just don't generate, our reports are a little different. They're not for sale reports. They're just for consumers to be able to figure out how to best do their product. So especially when it comes to concentrates and edibles and stuff like that. People are trying to figure out homogeneity, trying to figure out mixtures and percentages, and that's where that R&D testing comes into play. So once we figure out you are where you want to be, then you can call upon and ask for a legitimate test and a report, and which is just a few bucks more, but you get a legitimate report that you can turn around and sell on the market. And the R&Ds are not reported to the ODA, by the way. So that's just for you guys as information and knowledge. So the difficulties for labs, basically storage conditions for you guys. We go out to a lot of fields and farms, and we see it stored in a lot of different ways, and we really, it has to be stored in prime conditions and in ways that it's not going to degrade over time. So, yeah, the pre-harvest hemp samples, we do the whole tops, buds, and biomass. It's all tested a little bit differently, I guess, in a way. Biomass, we just make sure we have all the product, like the stems and stalks and everything. I guess that's about where I'm at. Improvements. So labs in general want to provide results to the clients they can trust. So when it comes to laboratories, there's a 20% allowance in variation. You want to find out if your laboratory's tightened up that tolerance a little bit. Our lab right now, we're at 15% tolerance. That way we can have a tighter window for you guys. Internal audits, you want to ask labs about their internal audits and what they do for their processes.
Accreditations, right? You guys are OR lab.
Yeah, so when it comes to laboratories, every laboratory is required to do 2 proficiency tests every year. The proficiency tests are blind tests, so we have to report back to the state of what we find. You should also be asking to see those numbers and all that information so labs can maintain their accreditation. So these are just questions that you want to make sure you can ask and go through. So we are ODA approved and licensed and ORLAP accredited. We've been around since 2012. So. No.
And just to add to that, I definitely think as a farmer, it's our responsibility if we're delivering products to a lab that we're delivering products that are an accurate representation of what we have. You hear stories all the time about people cherry picking their best buds and sending them in, or their best biomass and sending it in. That you're not doing yourself any favors by doing that. You want to be able to be transparent in your transaction and your processes. And it's important to send in the samples that are representative of what you have, because inevitably it's going to come out anyways, and it's only going to end up looking bad on you if you're trying to make your product out to be better than what it really is, because a lab's going to go extract it. They're going to have it tested, and they're going to come back to you and say, well, you said it was 10%, but it's actually 5%. And now you've just wasted your time, your credibility. Chances are they're not going to want to ever buy from you again, and you probably just wasted a month of your time trying to go down this path, and now you're right back where you started. So it doesn't do you any favors. Talking about testing specifically, like Dan was talking about, R&D testing, I highly recommend that throughout the season, just so you can track your CBD potency, so you can see what it's trending like week to week. Full panel testing is a little bit different in that that's when you're going to be looking at, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, heavy metals. So that's something that you really don't need to worry about until after you've harvested your product. So don't worry about, and that's the expensive test. That's the one that's probably going to cost you like $300-400. So don't worry about having that one done until you've got everything out of the field, out of the harvest, and then you can do it. But be aware, and I talk to people about this too. Like, you can have a test that shows up at no pesticides, no fungicides in your flour or your biomass, and then you go to an extractor and you have it turned into an oil. Well, when you have something turned into an oil, you're going to concentrate it usually by like 6x, maybe 5x. So you may have had a pesticide in there before that was non-detect, meaning it was below the reportable levels. But now that you've concentrated at 5x or 6x, now it shows up on a test. So don't assume that the lab somehow like screwed up your results or that they switched your results with somebody else. There's lots of different reasons why something like that could happen. That's just one of them. Maybe you went to a drying facility to have your product dried, and maybe it was a hemp dryer that did it. I've had instances where a hemp dryer had some transfer from a hops dryer had some transfer from a hop product that then they started doing hemp in their hops dryers, and it transferred over to the hemp. Maybe they didn't clean out their siphons well enough or something. So there's lots of different ways in which those things can kind of translate. So just don't always assume like the labs, again, they kind of get the blunt end of the stick because you've spent all this hard work, and then they hand you back a piece of paper and says like, here's the culmination of all your hard work, and it's a number that you think is significantly less than what you should have. But in most instances, it's probably accurate. I mean, like you said, within like 15%. So again, it's not, in most instances, the labs aren't trying to screw you over. They want to make sure that they're giving you accurate results, and it's only based off of the product that you give them. So give them, a fair and true representation of what you got, and they're going to give you back fair and true results. So, any questions? This one is going to be pretty short and sweet. Yes, go ahead and head over to the mic.
So if there is a 15% tolerance, that basically means the results are 85% correct?
Eric, do you want to talk about
And my follow-up question to that is, if we do want to have our sample analyzed at different labs, like even for flour, would it behoove us to homogenize that ourselves and send it in already pre-ground up, just so we make sure that it's the exact same material from the same plant and the same part of the plant?
I mean, you definitely can. I mean, there's no problem in doing that. Each lab is going to have their own process and procedure. So I usually recommend, if you doubt what your lab is doing, like the lab you sent it to, if you're unsure of those results, send. So what I usually do is actually I'll take my buds and I cut them in half, and I'll send half to the lab. That way I have the exact same half of that same plant that then I can send over to another lab and get a different result if I want to. Or I'll take another cola from that same plant, so that I always have basically 2 sample sets of the same, and I'll keep it, because that way I still have it, so I can go get it checked somewhere else and confirm. Well, this guy said 5, these guys said 10. All right, so what do we got here? So.
So really quick, as a laboratory in our proficiency testing that we do, basically what happens is they take a bunch of product and they turn around and homogenize it, like you were saying. And they turn around and after they homogenize it, they make sure they really, 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 really mix it, and then they mix it again and then they do it again. So anyway, it's really homogenized. And they turn around and pull samples of that, and they send that to each and every laboratory, and that's the way that so far has been the most accurate way for us as laboratories to do our proficiency testing, because we try to pick out, like he says, if you take, half the buds and, one lab, half the other, but it's really not ground and it's really not combined, but that's pretty close. So that will be a close representation, but the most accurate is to homogenize it all and divide it that way.
Any other questions? Yes. Sweet.
So if we're wanting to track potency during flowering, when would a good time to start testing be? How often should we do it? And then also, do you have any recommendations for balancing consistency of like tracking a particular plant's progress versus getting an accurate representation of your crop?
Yeah, so I usually don't. So my compliance test is usually that's the first test that I'll do, to where I will start tracking CBD after that. Because up until that point, like when I usually do compliance at week 5, my CBD number's 2%, maybe 3% at the most. So then I will start tracking it week to week after that. I go through and I mark the plants that I'm sampling every single time. So I'm sampling the same plants, so then I'm actually have the same set of data points. So if I start taking different plants, it doesn't do me any good because I can't really accurately compare them to the last batch of test results. I can only test compare them against the plants that I've already sampled. So I'll take that, that red tape or blue tape or whatever color it is, but that plastic tape, and I'll just go and tape it onto the plants that I've sampled. And then when I go do my samples the next week, I'll sample those same plants. And I just do that week after week. And I send out my R&D tests so I can track and see. And normally, I get anywhere from 10 to 20% week over week. Sometimes 25% increases in CBD. So,
can you speak to the value or how to use an early ratio test?
What's that now?
Can you speak to how to use a ratio test? I had the lab sold me on doing a ratio early on.
Oh, I honestly, I don't do them. I don't really see the benefit to them. I mean, do you have any?
Not really on a ratio test, no. Eric, do you have any comments?
We rarely do those.
Yeah.
You're talking like a CBD to THC, like a
Yeah.
25 to 1 or 1 to 30 or something like that.
Because I did 2 varieties. I did a Hawaiian Haze and a cherry wine, and they came back pretty different.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite know how to use it. The lab didn't explain to me. I was just guessing the ratio with time, what it might be, and it's the only thing I could deduce. It was just an early indicator of maybe the value of the genetic.
Possibly. I mean, it's it's no different than like someone saying my feminization rate is 99.9%. Like it's just really just a fact. It's just a fact of characteristic of that particular varietal. And I guess by doing that, you could confirm that it is a 1 to 25 or a 1 to 30. But even then, I mean, that plant itself, it's no different than any other phenotype. Like that plant within that strain could be a 1 to 25, but the one next to it could be a 1 to 27 or a 1 to 30, and you could see that much variation in between just those plants.
So just really not a useful data point.
I mean, to me, it's not right. If I'm going with a trusted seed supplier, anyways, then I would have to be able to. You would do that to confirm what the seed supplier is or isn't saying. So maybe you're doing it in a greenhouse setting, and you're doing it some trial stuff in the winter or in the off season to see if that's a variety that you're going to grow the following season. But because again, if you're going to try and maximize CBD, what he's talking about is like the THC to CBD ratio, and so. The higher your you want as high a ratio as possible, because 1% of CBD translates to 30% of CBD, and if we have 0.3 allowable, well, that means that if it's a 1 to 30, it's 0.3 and 10, so 0.3% THC and 10% CBD. So the higher that ratio is, the more CBD potentially we could have within a strain. So it's really only useful if you're trying to figure out what strains you're going to try and grow. Because you want to try and grow strains that have the highest CBD ratio, or if you're doing a breeding program, then I could see where you'd want to do that, because you'd want to only select the plants that had that highest CBD ratio. But if you're doing it on a production level, I don't really see there being any sort of value to that data.
So all of you that are new, don't bite on the ratio test that's sold to you.
Yeah, it may be neat to know, but there's no like useful application that you're going to be able to do with it.
Question for the analytical lab. I'm curious what kind of challenges you're expecting to face with obtaining your DEA certification, and whether or not, if you've handled hot crop in the past, if that's going to limit your ability to obtain that.
Thanks. I was hoping not to talk about this. This is a little bit of a sore subject for me, because I was the first lab to ever contact ORLAP, the accreditation body, and I said, hey, come and inspect me as a laboratory. They did, and Shannon later got in trouble for visiting me because she wasn't allowed to do that. But anyway, fast forward to the DEA stuff. I tried to apply or started to apply a while back, and I realized soon that there's a little thing in the DEA rules that state that if you get a DEA license, that I can only work with DEA companies, and therefore I cannot test cannabis or anything else anymore. And I really am not sure I want to do that with the laboratory. So the big challenge now is we're looking at, I do have another company, another laboratory, and we're probably going to open it up and license it strictly as just a DEA testing facility for potency and go down that road. It's a real dilemma in the industry right now, and all the labs are having a real hard time trying to figure out what to do, and this is the only thing I can think of to do with it is open up another lab and put it in the back room, call it Suite B, and that's a DEA lab.
Okay, so then what you're telling me is that if you only have one facility right now, in order to obtain those DEA certs, you would need to have a secondary facility that has not yet processed any hot crop in order to obtain that.
Yeah, well, and yeah, so when you apply for a DEA, okay, it's my understanding that because I actually applied here recently, and I proved my point, because when I applied, they sent me something back saying, hey, by the way, you're only going to be able to work with DEA companies. I'm like, thank you. Cancel. Anyway, I think that it hasn't been brought up yet, but it's my understanding that if I can only work with another DEA company, that you can only work with another DEA company. So you're not going to be able to sell to the other people unless they get all DEA licenses.
So if you have a DEA license, you're good.
Yeah, if you do. So, yeah.
I know some growers who pull their herms and some that don't feel it's necessary. What are your thoughts?
Any pollen sac that you see on the plant is going to have pollen in it, and it can pollinate a female plant. So yeah, if you've got hermaphrodited plants, pull them out of there. They're not going to produce CBD anyways, just because they're hermaphrodites. So the production is going to be going into seed production. So yeah, get them out.
And those are a lot harder to find.
Yep.
Do you know of any techniques in terms of farming to help like inhibit THC development without inhibiting CBD development? Like I've heard that too much nitrogen during flowering, for example, will boost your THC.
No, I mean, that's kind of all analogous. The only thing I will say, though, is so stress. If you stress the plant at any time, it will spike both THC and CBD at the same rate. So that's something just to be aware of. Some farmers will purposely do it. So I will oftentimes stress my plants at the very end if I'm going for extraction. So I want my CBD numbers as high as they can, and I really don't care what my THC number is because it's going to be an extracted product anyways that I'm selling within the state of Oregon. I will in my farm, we didn't water the last 2 weeks to help kind of stress that plant a little bit, because when it stresses, it's going to then signal something's wrong. I need to go ahead and try and exert every last bit of energy I have into trying to pollinate myself. And it does that by those trichomes and pumping that CBD production up and trying to get those oils in there so it creates an aroma, so it attracts pollinators and so forth. So stressing the plant is one way to do that, but you're never going to be able to promote one or the other, because like we were talking about earlier with the ratios, they're always going to trend in the same ratio. So if it's a 25-to-1, it's gonna trend in that same rate. Now I can pump them both up, but I can't pump one up versus the other.
I'll follow up on that. There seems to be a few unicorn growers on Instagram that maybe they're doing their own in-house stuff and they seem very capable, but 18% CBD and below 0.3 THC. Have you heard of that? If so, is that, I asked a guy for his COAs and he sent them. He didn't, there wasn't, it was just a little tech or a Excel box with some numbers,
I could take 30 you can take 30 COAs. I have 30 COAs in my inbox from hemp kush varieties, and and it's a genetic that I'm gonna be running a lot of this year. And I've got COAs from like 18% CBD and like 0.2% Delta 9, but I've got also COAs that say 16% and 0.5, and I've got COAs that say 20% and 0.7. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like with breeding in particular. There still is just so much genetic variation even within a particular strain, because these strains haven't been bred on a long enough timeline for those outlier characteristics to be eliminated, right? So like corn has been basically modified through breeding for over 100 years. So you can plant the entire field of corn and they're all going to be basically the exact same. It's not that they're genetically modified or any way, shape, or form other than through what we've done to them. So, 10 years from now, we're going to have a lot tighter genetic variation. So the COAs are going to be more consistent among any particular strain. So I guess my point is like, maybe if the guy grew 100 plants and maybe he had 100 tests, maybe he's just cherry picking the one where he sees it at 18 and 0.2, and that's the one he's showing you, right? Did I get it? Sure, but I didn't get him on 99 of my other plants.
My own experience just was curious if that's possible for a skilled breeder. I know of two guys that are proclaiming that, and one's a well-known guy in the Applegate with a big following and 95 acres and offers consultant services. And so I'm just curious if that's real.
Yeah,
and
30 to 1 right now is kind of the upper echelon of CBD, THC ratio, like to be able to consistently do that. I'm sure there probably are some breeders, and this is the industry as a whole. Like even on the weed side, every year there's strains that are more potent and different flavor profiles, and that's what this industry has always been, particularly on the weed side. What it's been about is like what's next, what's new, and we're able to make these huge leaps and bounds in a short period of time because it is a new product. And so, there may be somebody out there that's doing that on any large scale. I don't know, but I haven't really heard of anyone that's getting those kind of numbers. Like unless you're doing CBG. CBG is one of those plants where you basically CBG is the precursor to THC and CBD, and so there's a hormonal switch when you're breeding CBG, so that the CBG doesn't convert to either CBD or THC. It stays on that same CBG track. So in that instance, you can have really high CBG numbers and almost non-existent THC. But on the CBD side, I haven't seen any ratios that are anywhere near that high.
how would you say that what influences CBD and THC more, the genetics or the nutrition regime?
Genetics,
Okay.
absolutely.
So
Yeah, nutrition is like genetics. I look at it like genetics is like what you can achieve as long as all the other factors are in play. So someone asked me earlier, about microbes, adding bacillus and stuff to the soil, beneficial microbes. And I tell them, like, beneficial microbes are great because they allow the plant to be able to uptake nutrients better. But if you don't have those nutrients in the soil already, then what is there to uptake? So you have to start with the foundation, which is I have to have all the nutrients in my soil that my plant is going to achieve, that it needs, and then I can achieve those numbers that they claim. That's never going to achieve those numbers that are claimed if I don't already have the building blocks to get it there.
So if these unicorn these unicorn results are real, it's probably from a genetic standpoint, not a super special mix or growing method.
Yeah, no, they're selectively breeding particular plants. They're doing a really good job at it, and they're probably just hyper focusing on one or two plants, and then and maybe who knows, maybe this super breeder in 2 years is now able to produce replicate this breeding program on a large scale, and now they come out with these new seeds. That's IP, right? Like that's how companies are started. So it could be the building blocks of something like that.
Really quick, I know a lot of people that are up on like Mount Hood and different areas that are working with some pretty famous people all over the world, messing with genetics in their garages and stuff. So it is working, and people are doing different crazy stuff, but be very, 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 very careful. Don't trust a lot of people.